Whenever you're ready, when you don't hear the truck.
Hi, welcome to Taphotopia. Dogs. Hi, welcome to Taphotopia, where we visit cemeteries, meet fascinating previously living people, and unearth great stories one grave at a time. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you enjoy these videos. Today, we are in the South Buxton Cemetery in Buxton, Maine, to launch Taphotopia with a special two-part episode featuring John Brewster Jr. Let's go.
Let's go.
John Brewster Jr. was one of the most prolific early portrait painters in the young United States, the late 1700s to the early 1800s. There's about 250 portraits that are attributed to him. He worked in oil on canvas, oil on panels, and watercolor on ivory for miniatures. Tiny portraits that were often oval-shaped and were commonly worn as jewelry. And he painted portraits in New England for about 34 years. Now, John Brewster Jr. may be buried here in Buxton, Maine, but he was born in Hampton, Connecticut. John Brewster Jr. was born May 30th or 31st, 1766. We don't know the actual day that he was born. 1766 is, as you know, 10 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 1766, though, is the year that the first jigsaw puzzle was invented. Oh. It was invented in London, England by a cartographer, and it was a hand-colored map of Europe. 1766 is also the year that the Mason-Dixon line was completed, and 1766 is the year that the Townshend Acts were enacted by Parliament, and they taxed a whole number of things, including tea imported into the colonies. So John Brewster Jr. grew up in a world where the United States was being created.
I'm just going to pan around and show a little bit of the cemetery, and then we're going to take a hard left down this little lane.
So John Brewster Jr. was congenitally deaf. He was born deaf. He was born before an established language for the deaf in the US. He was born before ASL, before American Sign Language. He was born before there was an established education system for deaf children, but there were signed languages in the colonies, like Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. Right. But he was born before there was a standardized language across the early US and the colonies. His parents were hearing, his siblings were hearing, and he was the only deaf member of his family. So John Brewster Jr. was the third child of a growing family. His father, John Brewster Sr., was 27. He was the first doctor in Hampton, Connecticut, and he was a member of the Connecticut General Assembly. And his mom, Mary, was 24. There were two other small children in the family when John Brewster Jr. was born. His older sister, Mary, who was about 3.5, and his older brother, William, who was almost 2. And after some time, the family had about 7 kids. And here's Mr. Brewster. So John Brewster Jr.'s mom died when she was 41 years old. His father, 6 years later, remarries, and eventually there are 4 more children in the family. But by this time, John Brewster Jr. is 24 years old. It was a Puritan family. John Brewster Jr. is a 7th generation member of the Brewster family that came over on the Mayflower. John Brewster Jr. is the great-great-great-great-grandson of William Brewster. As for John Brewster Jr.'s childhood, we actually know very little. His education, if any, was limited, but there is evidence that as a young guy, John Brewster Jr. began to demonstrate an interest and probably a talent in painting. In 1779, John Brewster Jr. was 12 or 13 years old, and there was a Poughkeepsie, New York journal that published an ad for John Brewster Jr. as a portrait painter, and the ad included the information that John Brewster Jr. was deaf. The ad included the phrase, all who may please to favor him in his unfortunate situation will be satisfied. We don't know who wrote the ad or who helped him write the ad. We don't know who placed the ad. We don't even know if he booked any clients based on it, but it does show that at an early age, John Brewster Jr. knew that he wanted to paint. When John Brewster Jr. was about 24, 25, he took painting and portrait lessons from a local, largely self-trained artist, clergyman, and entrepreneur named Joseph Stewart. Joseph Stewart painted portraits. One of Joseph Stewart's portraits was of his friend and local minister, the Reverend James Cogswell. James Cogswell kept an extensive diary. In 1790, the Reverend James Cogswell wrote, "Dr. Brewster's son, a deaf and dumb young man, came in the evening. He is very ingenious. He has a genius for painting and can write and converse by signs so that he may be understood in many things. He lodged here." A year later, the Reverend James Cogswell again wrote in his diary, quote, "Brewster, the deaf young man, was at my house when I came home. He tarried and dined here. He appears to have a good disposition and an ingenious mind. I could converse but little with him, not being acquainted with the signs." According to author Harlan Lane, the late Harlan Lane was an internationally recognized advocate for the deaf. He was an author and he was a psychology professor at Northeastern University. Harlan Lane wrote that he felt it seems likely that it was Reverend Cogswell who introduced Joseph Stewart to the ingenious deaf young artist John Brewster Jr. So, how to describe what John Brewster Jr. did? John Brewster Jr. was an artist. He was a painter, he was a portraitist, but this is the great word to use, he was a limner. It's not a word we use today, but it's a word that still applies. A limner, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is a painter, especially a portrait painter. But John Brewster Jr. wasn't just a limner, he was an itinerant limner. And the life of an itinerant limner in the late 1700s and early 1800s was one of continuous travel. Those who were not well known or well established would go from town to town, much like a door-to-door salesman, knocking on the doors of well-to-do homes, hoping to book gigs. And unlike today, in John Brewster Jr.'s time, being an artist was not a calling to simply express yourself. In John Brewster Jr.'s time, painting a portrait was much like painting a sign or painting a house. It was simply a practical thing. And those who were not able to fully support themselves with painting only would also do ornamental paintings on clocks and furniture and signs and coaches. Sometimes they would also do landscapes. But John Brewster Jr. swam in a completely different circle. John Brewster Jr. came from a family of doctors with a well-connected circle of friends and family. But by the 1790s, John Brewster Jr. also was traveling New England trying to book clients. How would John Brewster Jr. acquire jobs? There would be word of mouth, but there's also newspaper advertisements. In 1802, in the Newburyport Herald and Country Gazette in Newburyport, Massachusetts, there was an advertisement that read, quote, "John Brewster Jr., portrait and miniature painter, respectfully informs the ladies and gentlemen of Newburyport that if they wish to employ him in the line of his profession, he is at Mr. James Prince's, where a specimen of his painting may be seen. He flatters himself, if any will please to call, they will be pleased with the striking likenesses of his and with the reasonableness of his prices. If there is no application made to him within 10 days, he will leave town." And that is a bit like the classic advertisement of operator standing by. This is a limited time offer. Call today. Some advertisements also did include prices. In 1809, 7 years later, John Brewster Jr. returns to Newburyport, Massachusetts, and he posts a new ad, but this time, this ad includes the prices. Portraits were $15 and miniatures were $10. And if you translate those into 2021 dollars, portraits were approximately $350 and miniatures were approximately $230.
Reasonable.
So out of John Brewster Jr.'s 250 portraits, they have been described as hauntingly beautiful, ethereal, luminous, sweetly appealing, charming, and filled with stillness and elegance. One striking feature of his paintings is his subject's eyes. Paul D'Ambrosio, president and CEO of the Fenimore Art Museum, said in an interview, "Brewster focuses on the sitter's face, the eyes, the expression, and he de-emphasizes the setting in the background. Brewster is making a profound connection with each sitter, and I think it can only be attributed to the heightened sense of visual awareness that comes with not having access to one other crucial sense." A specialty of John Brewster's was children. He painted more children than most of his contemporaries. And in 1807, he painted a portrait that is cute. It is cute by today's standards, but when you consider that the early 1800s was a world filled with rules and expectations, I think that this painting is even more remarkable. The painting today is known as One Shoe Off, and it was painted in 1807. It is a painting of a little girl in a white dress with a red shoe on her right foot, and she is holding the other shoe. And just like kids do today. And to take the time to paint, not take a photograph, but to paint a little girl with one shoe, holding one shoe, I believe shows that John Brewster Jr. has a great sense of humor. And he was also great with kids. Other portraits that John Brewster Jr. did of children include A Child with a Peach, painted in 1810, Francis O. Watts with a Bird, painted in 1805, and again in 1810 he painted the Dow Twins. You might be wondering, how does an itinerant limner from Connecticut end up in the rural town of Buxton, Maine? Well, it has to do with one of his brothers. His brother, Royal, was the fifth child of the family, and he was 4 years younger than John Brewster Jr. In 1795, Royal Brewster was a physician, like his father, and he moved to Buxton, Maine, which at that time was little more than wilderness. And in November 22, 1795, Royal Brewster marries Dorcas Coffin. Dorcas is the daughter of the Reverend Paul Coffin, who was the first established minister here in Buxton. 10 years later, in 1805, Royal has a handsome federal-style house built across the road from the church where Dorcas's father, the Reverend Paul Coffin, preaches. And that church is right on the edge of the cemetery.
And the Brewster house, you can't quite see it because of the foliage, but there's a picket fence and a house, and that's actually called Brewster Corner.
Around that time, when he was 39 or 40, John Brewster Jr. moves to Buxton to live with his brother and his sister-in-law. Then, about 10, 11 years later, John Brewster Jr. does something that we find remarkable. At age 51, at the height of his career, he suspended his painting and made a choice that I think everyone can draw inspiration from. So to find out what John Brewster Jr. did at the age of 51, at the height of his career, you will have to come back and watch part 2 of our visit with John Brewster Jr. But before you do that, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we will see you again soon.
And why don't we have a picture of John Brewster Jr.?
John Brewster Jr. never painted a picture of himself, and as far as we know, no one else did either.
We'll see you later, John Brewster Jr.